Welcome back to The Nuance. Today I am on with Oliver, and this is going to be one of those calls that are the main premise of this show, which is basically just chatting with you about your health and fitness goals and struggles and how we can go about making those a little bit easier, a little bit more simple, or a little bit more accessible. So I have a tiny bit of background in terms of what you are trying to do, kind of like what your main focus and your goal is right now, but it's obviously helpful for the listeners to hear if it comes straight from you. And it gives me a little bit more context as well. If you can kind of just let me know what drew you to coming onto the show to kind of like ask for, my help, my guidance, like what is the main thing that you're looking to achieve in regards to your health and fitness at this point? And that can kind of lead us into where you've been, what you've been trying, what's working, what's not, so we can potentially fill in some of those gaps.
Absolutely. So, I guess I've sort of been a non-traditional athlete in my life. I've had periods of fitness, periods of not fitness. And for the last 3 years, I've been coming out of one of those long periods of not fitness, of not doing much of anything. And, I started following you on Instagram for the last at least year or so. And, a lot of the things that you've said have really sort of hit home to me on Instagram. Even like one of the most recent posts, like, if you're doing the workout properly, it's not going to get easier. Like it's always going to be hard.
Right. Even
Right.
little things like that help you. It's the perspective, the mindset shift about like, oh yeah, not all. We often think about getting stronger, better, but how often do we think about the whole goal of like, well, we're chasing that challenge or chasing the difficulty.
Right.
Might be a little bit easier for somebody like you to understand that. Like to me, it makes sense because sounds like you come from like an athletic background. One of the things I find myself thinking about with why there's a potential disparity or discrepancy in kind of like those who really find easy success with health and fitness versus those who seem to struggle with it. Oftentimes the ones it comes easier to are the ones that have grown up in sports or grown up from a very young age exercising or training, because we're kind of almost taught the first time you get into the weight room or whatever sport you're playing, like you're going to have to push yourself really hard physically. And if you just kind of start that with exercising in like late 20s, 30s, 40s, it's a foreign concept to be like, this is supposed to actually feel uncomfortable and hard. But yeah, just such a simple way of doing that. Like it's always going to be, as tough as that can sound. It's just the truth. It's supposed to be challenging.
And I'm 46, so I'm a late Gen Xer, I guess. But and in terms of sport, like I'm sort of a one-trick pony, right? I'm a rower. I have a crew background.
Well, that is physically challenging.
Yes,
My goodness,
physically challenging. And I got into that in high school because really, I have poor hand-eye coordination. If it involved a ball or a bat,
to catch, throw,
yeah, it wasn't my thing. And also, not really high on like, rhythm and balance. But I'm tall, relatively tall, right?
There's a lot of rhythm in rowing, is there not? Like there's a cadence that you have to follow.
Well, there is, but I mean, I could follow a cadence, right? But like,
true, that's
especially
it's not it's a different type of coordination, I guess.
It's a different type of coordination.
And dancing is different with rhythm and rowing, I would say, right? Like,
right.
There's the difference there.
And you mess up in rowing, you're going to get hit in the face with an oar, right? Like it's there's a big consequence to that,
right?
But so I did that in high school, and then I foolishly didn't do that in college, which I regret to this day. And then I started in like my late 20s, early 30s. I got back into trying to get fit because I was really unhealthy. And first I started out with biking, and then a roommate of mine at the time had opened like one of the first CrossFit boxes in the area. So I got into that. And then I got back into rowing in a master's team, which was great. I loved it. I did that for a couple years. But, when you have to have hands on the boat at 5:30 in the morning, right, you don't have and you're working full time. There's not a lot of time for anything else. So I did that for a couple years, loved it. But then, my job got kind of crazy. I had the long soul crushing commute. I live in the DC area, and I got really unhealthy. And then I turned 40, and, all sort of the warning signs were flashing red. And, so I struggled a bit to get back into doing something because I do tend to have that mindset. I know you've talked about it before where like, I have to wait until the first of the month, or I have to wait until the beginning of the year. And then I'm going to start. And after a couple of years of trying to do that and failing, about 3 years ago, almost within a week or so, I started rowing again. And, first, I just sort of got on the rower and I found like an online plan. I'm like, I'm going to do this 3 days a week. I don't care how slow I have to go. At the time, I was like 250 pounds. Which is a lot for me. And I was able to stick with it, and I increased that from 3 days to 4 days to 5 days. Then I ended up getting an online rowing coach, which has really helped me out a lot. He gives me a plan every week. And
So you
then,
still love rowing? I'm gonna just as a question. Sounds like the answer is yes. You keep coming back to it. Maybe it's just what you know, the devil you know, right?
It's a little bit of both. Like, I do love it. I would love to get out on the water, right? But my schedule doesn't. It's hard because I live about half an hour away from the Potomac, and to be on a master's team, like I'm married, like I get in trouble if I go to bed before 11 o'clock at night. Waking up at 4 a.m, like I'm going to have to go to bed early. Right. And that's not like once or twice a week. That's, like 5 days a week. But I do. I love rowing. I don't know if I love indoor rowing, but the erg is just so monotonous and soul crushing sometimes. And I have to remind myself, like what you said, like it's always hard. There's never those ads you see for like rowing machines where people are smiling in their tracksuit. Like, that does not happen in real life, right? I'm never sitting on the erg smiling thinking, wow, this is great. I'm in my 1970s basement on my erg, and I'm like, this is, the long steady stays. I'm like, this is terribly boring. Why is this seat so uncomfortable? And then the shorter like sprint pieces, I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, I'm fighting for my life with each stroke, right?
Yeah, part of that tells me that you're doing it right. You know what I mean? Because
Right.
that means you're putting forth that effort. But yeah, sometimes it really is just you get through it because you know that it's good for you, that you have to. But the reason that I asked was just because the more and more I have shifted away from my own personal like competitive athletic career and started to work more with just general everyday people who married, have kids, work long commutes or whatever. Like, there's all kinds of life stuff going on outside of just what I'm doing with my nutrition and my training. My perspective has shifted towards, if I can get somebody to think about what is the lowest hanging fruit, simplest thing that I can do, that it's the least miserable, and I wish there was a better way of putting it, of saying that, but truly it sometimes it breaks down to like, no part of me is going to come at this saying like, maybe you should do something different besides rowing. But that's just why I asked, because yes, it should be hard, challenging, and we're not always going to look forward to doing this stuff because it is hard, but we shouldn't be miserable most of the time. You know what I mean? And I guess we'll kind of transition into kind of what you're doing additional to that and like the resistance training and whatnot. But that component is where some people just go way too far with like, oh, I think I need to be doing every single day or 6 days per week. And it's kind of, let's scale back so that you don't hate your life just to get this certain outcome that you think that you want,
Right.
But yeah, it's a kind of hate-love relationship, which most people have that with training and exercise. Truly.
Right. And like the hardest part for me many days is just sitting on the erg. If I could sit on the erg, then I'm fine, right? And I do really enjoy the feeling once I've finished, right? I'm like, wow, yep. I had this really hard thing I had to do, and I did it. And, no one's over my shoulder. It's not like a work-related thing. And, oftentimes, that's the hardest thing I'll do in my day is my rowing piece, right? And so a little bit of accomplishment. But it did, I went from 250 pounds, and I'm 6'1", to like, 200, 210, somewhere in that ballpark is sort of normally where I am. And, I've done that for 3 years now. And a couple of things that really sort of struck home to me is I have a little bit of weightlifting background just from the time I was in CrossFit, right? But other than that, and doing like circuits when I was on a rowing team, I don't have a lot. I am very fortunate. I have a fairly well-equipped home gym. Now, I'm in Maryland, and it's in a detached garage, which is not heated.
Oh, so right now it's a little rough.
It's a little rough. I put a big, like 240-volt space heater in my garage, and that'll get me about 10 degrees above ambient temperature.
Ooh,
So if it's
most of the winter.
normal, right? But if it's like normal winter temperatures, that's not bad for me. But like it's been bitter cold here for weeks, and it's I'm in the garage and it's like 37 degrees, so it
Yeah,
makes it
that's
hard.
trust me, I am from in that same regard. I've gotten weaker since moving to Florida. I swear, like it has created this higher baseline level of if it drops below this, I can't do it. And so I work out in my garage, obviously. And now in the winter here, the days are like 48 degrees in the morning. And on days like that, I'm like, I don't want to get out in the garage. It's too cold to go train in there. So
Right.
I mean, I get it, even though mine's nowhere near that.
So I've played around with weightlifting before, and I've sort of struggled to incorporate that into my rowing because, I mean, I guess my overarching fitness goal is, quality of life, and I look at my father. My father's 80. He was a cyclist for most of his life. He was riding 7, 8, 9,000 a year. He was always very aerobically fit, but he never really lifted weights, and now that he's in his 80s, like he's just sort of, shrank, like the
Right.
incredible
Little
shrinking
more
man,
fragile.
more fragile. So that's sort of my overarching goal, right? And then also, I would really like to add mass, upper body, especially, but also legs, right? But also like trim around my waist because I've never, for as hard as I've worked, I've never really been able to see an ab in my life, right? Now, and part of that too is, I love to eat. I love to cook. I'm married. My husband loves to cook. We're sort of imperfectly matched in this one regard that he has incredible self-control when it comes to eating. So he will go out to the grocery store. He'll see Ghirardelli chocolate squares on sale, and he'll think, well, maybe
Just walk right
sometime in the
by him.
next. Well, no, he'll think sometime in the next month, I might want one of these, and he'll buy it and he'll take
For
it
you.
home
Gotcha.
and he'll put it away in a cabinet, and then I'll come across it. And, I can ignore it for a day or two, but if it's in the house, I'm going to eat it. And if I have one, then I have all of them. Whereas I go to the store, I don't go down that aisle.
Right.
I
You
don't
just avoid.
just avoid it. So, I've been rowing. I've lost some weight. I've gone down in waist size. So I'm really happy about that. But I still, I still struggle in my midsection, and I've been lifting weights now for about 12 weeks consistently, about 4 days a week until this past week where because of the cold, I was like, I'm just going to take some shortcuts. I'm not going to fully warm up. And I pinched something.
Yeah, let's say you pull a muscle or something like that.
It's not bad. It's like a number, like a pain scale. It's like a number 3, right?
Okay.
And being 46, I had to fight this, but I had the good sense to like, okay, I'm just going to stop for today.
Right.
I'm
Not push through.
not
That
going to
is
try and
good.
push through. I mean, I was thinking about it, right? But I didn't do it. So this week, I basically I only lifted once. My rowing, I average 52,000 meters a week right now.
And is that still 4 days? Or is that
5 days
3
a
at this
week.
point? Oh,
5
so
days
you've
a
gone
week.
all the way up to 5. Okay.
5. So I try to stay at 5 days a week with rowing, about 52,000 meters each week. And if I average out, the concept 2, which is what I use, the rowing machine is very stingy with giving you calories, right? So I
Yeah.
tend to sort of trust that. So an average workout is about 900 calories normally. So, a couple days are steady state, long distance pieces. A couple days are varied rate, varied length. And then there's at least once a week, sometimes twice, like the shorter sprint pieces.
And I'm assuming you're doing those at least like 4 of the days that you are lifting weights. You are
Right.
also rowing those days as
Right.
well. Right.
Right.
Do you do that one like sequential workout in the morning, or is that split up across the day?
No. So typically I work from home for the most part. So at lunchtime is typically when I'll do my row. And then in the evening after work, like around 5 o'clock, I'll go and I'll do my lifting piece.
Interesting. I feel like it's not all that often that people will say that, no, I separate them. It's usually, when I go to the gym, I'm doing the cardio either before or after. That's, in my opinion, as long as you are eating in between as well, at least a meal, right, is probably going to be the most optimal way you could split that. So that's cool. Obviously, you have with the flexibility. Not everybody can do that with
Right.
going into the office jobs or whatnot.
Occasionally, like if I really have to, if I'm like something weird with my schedule, if it's rowing and then lifting with my arms, I can combine that together.
Right.
But the
You
thought
probably wouldn't
of
be able to do a squat or anything. Your legs would be
right,
trashed.
right, or I've also struggled with should I lift first or should I row first? And I always come back to rowing first because I'm like, I can't imagine doing like 15,000 meters after I was lifting for an hour.
Yeah, and I mean, over the lifespan of your training career, that's kind of just been your primary modality. So it kind of makes sense to keep it that way. Although there is an argument that could be made if your main outcome goal right now was, I want to see that body recomposition change. I want to kind of trim up around the waist. Well, if that's the main goal, and regardless of where we go here, the nutritional component is going to be the primary focus for sure. But an argument could be made that the resistance training beforehand would change things a little bit so that is prioritized above the cardiovascular output, because you might be sacrificing a minuscule, marginal, probably insignificant amount of change, but not zero. You know what I mean? If you were
Okay.
lifting first, not enough that I would recommend overhauling your schedule. If you're able to get those 4 lifts in and 5 rows in, like every week pretty darn consistently, I don't think the frequency of what you're doing right now or like the schedule of that needs to change. The nutritional component is probably going to be the primary piece, as long as within the resistance training that you're doing, like what do those 4 sessions look like? Do you break those up in the upper, lower type of approach?
Upper, lower. And then one other thing too that a year and a half ago, we got a puppy, a Doberman pinscher. So Myrtle the Doberman requires about 6 miles worth of walks
still
each
very
day.
active, I'd imagine.
Yeah, so I typically don't take her on all of her walks. Like we split up the walks, but I mean I'm averaging 12,000 steps a day, most of which is walking the dog. Yeah,
right, which is good. I mean, from a fat loss standpoint, I think that activity level is going to go much further than the rows are, even though those are substantial chunks of calories that you're burning. Like you're working during those sessions for sure, but even still, 12,000 steps per day, moving 200 and somewhere between 200 and 210 pounds that whole time, I would say is probably it's going to be more of a total caloric expenditure. So that's going to actually be the most impactful thing. But that's, even with you just saying that, solidifies even more in my mind that, okay, the main thing that should shift, the lowest hanging fruit, is going to be, no pun intended, the food. Like, what are you actually consuming? What are you eating? So what does that look like outside of, like, let's just not consider are the most dense meals that you and your husband share going to be dinners most of the time, right? Like,
dinner, right.
Let's just say outside of that, let's take away the element of we like really good food. What's a normal day look like up until that point on any of those days, or the weekends, however they differ? Let's just say, well, it's a Sunday today. Let's say tomorrow on Monday. Like, what would that look like for you up until dinner?
So my meals tend to start off really good, and they get kind of
like
less
across
good.
the week, you mean, or across the day?
No, across the day. So breakfast is pretty spot on. I typically have, like a lot of people, the same breakfast every day for the most part, except for like maybe once a week I'll have like a lumberjack breakfast or something with pancakes and bacon and all that. But my normal breakfast is, 1 serving of plain old-fashioned oatmeal, some fresh fruit, some flax seeds for the fiber. And I was eating 4 whole hard-boiled eggs, but now I'm taking the yolks out, trying to cut down a little bit of the calories. Yeah. Drink a lot of coffee, but I use skim milk in my coffee instead of, like whole milk, or heavy whipping cream is what I would really prefer in my coffee. Lunch is usually, try to keep it, on a good day, I try to keep it between 2 dishes, one of which would either be like high protein pasta, ground turkey, marinara sauce, And then the other one would be rice, ground turkey, some frozen vegetables, and maybe like a little bit of sriracha and soy sauce in there. And then dinner, like we eat like men. It's like a protein, a starch, always
Kind
something
of like the
green.
steak and potatoes type thing, meat and
Right,
potatoes.
right. On the positive side, like we don't eat out a lot. I don't eat very much we eat very little fast food or processed food. We both cook, so most of our meals, are made from scratch, but they tend to be on the rich side. Like last weekend, we had Salisbury steaks, right, with mashed potatoes. I mean, there was a stick of butter in the mashed
Say the
potatoes.
butter.
Yeah, yeah. And, the Salisbury steaks are pan fried in butter, and then there's a gravy,
And if you have a veggie, it's probably got some bacon on it or also cooked in
cheese.
butter. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And we eat late because we go to bed late. So, dinner is typically 8 o'clock in our house. 7:30, 8 o'clock. Go to bed typically 11 o'clock, midnight. And then there's always like the fourth meal, right?
Okay, so there are
Or,
snacks too, like the treats afterwards.
right, like around 10 o'clock, dessert, a baguette, a baguette and bread, something like that. And that's where I really come off the rails. And also, like I've been trying to track at least breakfast and lunch, because when I do dinner, I get a little scared.
Don't even want to see the numbers.
Right. But like, for instance, like I typically eat lunch right after I row. So like I'll be down there rowing for an hour straight. It's like 15,000 meters. I come up and I am
You're hungry,
famished.
right?
Right. So like, and unlike you, the last episode, like you don't have to tell me to eat carbs. Like I love carbs. I'm going to eat a lot of carbs. Like, I'll have like a cup and a half of rice in my little bowl, right? And plain white rice, not like not brown rice, but
Yeah, I'm a jasmine or basmati all the way. White too. I know they
white.
make brown of both of them, but
Right. Not for me. Not for me. Just give me the plain white jasmine rice. So it's hard to like come out of that and then just eat like because now that I've been tracking it, I'm like, oh my God, like, I've eaten all my carbs for the day and it's only
from
lunchtime.
So you are tracking
Somewhat.
calories,
Yeah.
macros, or at least up to those two meals. So when you say that, I'm curious then, like, what is a target for carbs for the day that you're already hitting by lunchtime?
Well, I can tell you that. I don't have to remember that off the top of my head, but I can pull it up here real quick.
Because one of the things that immediately jumped into my mind was pretty big gap between lunch and dinner if you are eating late, which that could have an impact on those hunger levels, not only at dinner, but, if you're rushing through that as we, the men, I feel like not everybody, but I eat pretty darn quickly. You know what I mean? Sometimes I have to remind myself, slow down, chew, bite, you know what I mean? And if you go through that dinner fairly quickly because you're, starving, it's very easy to kind of like immediately after still be like, I'm hungry. I'm going to go get one of those treats now or whatever. And then, yeah, if you've got enough time after you have that before bed, there's another snack, the other treat. So that gap between lunch and dinner was one thing that I was kind of like, oh, that seems like something that we might want to fill, have a placeholder or a fill in between. But also, with three main meals where you're going to be consuming protein as well. I'm curious where your total daily protein intake is coming to, because just your description of breakfast, I'm like, that could probably be bumped up a little bit if you're only having 4 egg whites worth of protein plus the little bit that's in the oats. That could probably be increased a little bit. But yeah, the carbs from a daily, since you meant like, I'm already out of them or hitting all of them, what's that number that you're hitting by lunch?
So for carbs, 50 grams. Protein, which I actually think I have trouble meeting, is 200 grams.
Yeah, I was going to say by my math, you're probably around, without this additional numbers that come from whatever the snacks are at the end of the night or throughout the day. I don't know. Do you snack during the day at all? Between meals or not really?
So I don't snack at all between breakfast and lunch. I do snack typically, unfortunately, but right before dinner, because I'll come in from lifting right before dinner, and dinner's not quite ready, so I'll have something before then. Then I'll have dinner, then another snack, then just like, because then at this point, like I can't eat enough.
Yeah, already I'm thinking if we want to, from the almost half an hour we've been talking about, the one thing that I would say if you want to change your approach to your nutrition, it's to not go into you're going into 2/3 of your entire, day's worth of eating, your meals, 2 out of 3 hungry. You know what I mean? Like rabbit, like whether it be because of a long gap and or a long gap of time and you've just trained twice per day, you know what I mean, which we have
Hmm.
seen over and over from anecdotal experience and research that that's going to drive up those hunger signals. And the more you move, oftentimes that can lead to higher consumption because our bodies want to compensate. So yeah, that's a very simple kind of just behavioral thing. Is like, it sounds like a little bit more frequent meal consumption would go a long way, so you're not having these big gaps of, well, now I'm, it's been 6 hours since I've had a meal, and I had now just trained hard for an hour as well. At the tail end of that, your hunger is going to be through the roof. So in my mind, I'm thinking very small-ish breakfast, from even from a carb standpoint. Like, let's just split it in half: 75 grams of carbs in breakfast and lunch. That's going to get you to that 150 you're saying that you're kind of hitting already.
Hmm.
You're having 75 grams of carbs in the morning and then going 4 to 5 hours without eating anything, and then you are getting on the rower for an hour of hard training. So basically, you're probably burning through all of that by the time you eat that lunch again. And then boom, you're going to maybe replenish that. But that's at what, noon, 1 p.m.
Right.
And then you're
One or
eating
two.
dinner
Yeah.
6 hours again later, after another training session where, okay, you might not burn through 75 grams worth of carbs in just a lifting session, but still you're walking the dog between that. Like, you're using your brain for work and whatnot. You're kind of like going through this like depletion refill. And then since you're never quite coming over that might be where that hunger level is at the end of the night. Snacks, snacks, snacks. So it could be as simple as make sure that there's always something pre-workout in that peri-workout nutrition, instead of just right now you've got the post down, getting protein and carbs afterwards. But could be as simple as like, hey, I'm throwing down a banana. Could be just that, or just a banana and peanut butter before those training sessions. That way you're splitting that gap at least a little bit. I would ideally, in a perfect world, like to see another whole meal in there somewhere, just because, again, doing the math, I'm like, your lunch and dinner probably both have, let's say, 45 grams of protein on average. I wouldn't say that that's an overestimation. If you're eating turkey and then whatever, steak at night, 45 is definitely doable. That puts you at like 90 ish per day there, plus your 25-30 from breakfast. So that's 120, 130 for the day. Like you said, that's pretty far short of that 200 gram, which I wouldn't say, that whole 1 gram per pound of body weight is necessary for everybody, but you're pretty darn active. So that's going to be one thing that I would say is probably going to be crucial, beneficial, definitely going to make a difference if you bump that up even 40 grams a day additional, another 50 to get you up towards 160, 170. That'll get you a lot closer to the where I put most people around zero 0.7 grams per pound of their body weight, and say that that's pretty much enough to cover most people's basis. And that would be about one additional whole meal for you at some point in the day, which sounds like it could be doable because you work from home, right? Certainly
Hmm.
some prep work and preparation needed to make that happen. But I think that that could be a kind of like a weekly routine change that either you do on your own, you talk with your husband about as well, and said, like, how can we make this work so that I have like a second lunch? Or I always joke, are you a Lord of the Rings fan?
No, I'm not
No,
actually.
I always throw out 11 C's. They just talk about like eating multiple times throughout the day. But
Okay.
second lunch, 11 C's, whatever you want to call it, just like an additional meal somewhere in there, so that you are, not going those big periods of time. Does that sound about right though with that
Yeah.
protein? Like, you were around like 130 per
Yeah.
day
No,
on
that
average?
sounds right. Yeah.
And that's the most, when we think about protein, we think about muscle, right? So yeah, with your goal of optimizing body composition, changing, putting mass on, you need it for that. I really don't, I mean, it is one of the most satiating nutrients as well, outside of maybe just below fat, in terms of filling you up, making you feel full. And so it will make a difference in terms of your hunger come 8, 9, 10 p.m. as well, if you have gotten an additional 50 grams of protein in per day. But I really do think that that like immediate hunger that you're feeling is more so due to the high activity level in between, or, in the middle of really long gaps without eating. So I would also say, I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like you got to get these carbs in pre-workout. You could even just add an additional serving of oats to that breakfast, so that you're now at 175 grams of carbs, or even up to 200 by midday. Because I think you could do with a decent amount more intentionally, because, and this is just an assumption, like I have no idea where you actually end up if you were to track Have you had a day recently where you were like, I'm going to track everything no matter what, even the baguette at the end of the night, even everything that's in that dinner? Because I'm curious if you actually, like, in reality, consume 400 grams of carbs, you know what I mean? Or if you in reality consume 250, it's hard to know.
Yeah, I actually I have not, and I really need to do that. At first I was like, I'm not going to track anything, and then I was like, well, clearly, because as soon as I started lifting, I'm like, the scale started to go up, right? And I try not to obsess over the scale. I don't really, for the most part, but well, I mean, at very first, I was very restrictive. The scale went down, right? But I was like eating dinner. I was making my own dinner, and it was very sad. I was like, my husband's like, I'm going to make chicken fried rice tonight, and I'm sitting there eating, a very basic salad and a piece of salmon, right?
Right. So not only is that sad, but you probably, after not too long, if you kept up with the rowing, at least if you were lifting during that time too, even more so, like you probably got pretty hungry the first thing in the morning the next day, or like you're
Right,
starting from like this deficit, just
right.
this like severe one.
And so then I started to not do that, right? Because that was just it was miserable, right? I'm like, I can't do this indefinitely. And so then I was like, okay, well, I started to track, breakfast, and then I'd track lunch, and I'd be, oh my god, like I'm like carbs are way over, like this is not carbs are way over, protein is way down, like so I'm just. And then sometimes I'm like, how do you, dinner, like we had pot roast last night, like how do I track pot roast, right? Like
Yeah. So I don't think that there's a need to be super specific with that. I don't know if you listened to the last call that I had with Dana on my last episode. I think a similar type of strategy would work well here, where
okay.
you just assume dinner's going to be fairly dense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's a pot roast, whether it's chicken fried rice, chicken parm, whatever, there's going to be a decent protein source, a fairly hefty carb source, and a good chunk of fat as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could probably get by, and you'd be better off because at least you have some type of accounting for what dinner is, as opposed to I'm just going to track up through lunch and then have no clue. If you just set a placeholder for, hey, our dinners when we make them at home are going to be roughly 45 grams of protein, like I said. Maybe they're going to be 80 grams of carbs and 50 grams of fat, which is a good, 50 grams of fat is definitely, I think is a high for a meal. Like when I track, like I have very rarely have meals that go anywhere near that, individual meals. But if you're having a steak, gravy with whatever it's cooked with, butter on your mashed potatoes, cheese on top of you can get 50 grams of fat in a meal pretty easily, right?
Right.
So maybe you split the difference there and say, oh, well, we're going to be a little bit more mindful, maybe cut back on the added fats or whatnot, but still that placeholder is going to be at least 35 for that meal fat. And I didn't do the math in my head here. I don't know what 45 grams of protein, 80 carb, and 35 fat equals, but you could very easily just have that. Hey, that's going to be my dinner that I track no matter what the dinner is every single night. It's just kind of a placeholder. And then that show you a little bit more accurately, well, where am I actually falling every single day as a whole? Because if you do that, it's mindless. You just press your placeholder button and track it. Maybe you are more apt to say, well, I'm going to log what these snacks are at the end of the night too. If it's the baguette, if it's a bowl of cereal or whatever, so that you have a better idea of, well, I'm actually averaging 400 grams of carbs per day. Which, if that's the case, certainly there's the obvious intervention would be, well, let's reduce that a little bit, right? If I want to be losing fat, I got to be in a slight deficit. I could reduce that. Or it could just be well, let me try and reallocate that more appropriately so that everything I said 5 minutes ago with, can I have some carbs pre-workout? Can I have an additional meal in between my lunch now and my dinner, so that those 400 grams of carbs are going a longer way for me and serving me and more purposeful, as opposed to I get 200 grams of those in at night, after I've done my
Right.
training and whatnot. And again, at that point too, it could be like, who knows where that's coming from? If it's coming from,
Ice cream.
sugar, right? That
Yeah.
stuff, versus if you had a little bit more oats and rice earlier in the day, same 400 grams of carbs, but different outcome, and you're going to feel a lot different. So that would be the first step, to try and just establish a little bit of that awareness. That I would recommend is, even if you're estimating it like that, to try and figure out where are you actually falling, because that's going to give you the most obvious next step with, wow, I really do need to cut that down. Like I am eating way too many calories. Or, you know what, this is actually isn't that bad. I'm saying 400 grams of carbs out there as a random number, but that might sound really, really high to you. I have eaten personally 400, between 400 and 500 grams of carbs every single day for the last near decade. So it's relative, I wouldn't say
Mm-hmm.
that 100, I heard you say 150 earlier and was like, I think that that's really low for your activity level, because I only
Okay.
average 10 to 12,000 steps per day, actually maybe even less more often than not. And I only at this point work out 3 times per week, maybe 4. And I'm not doing any cardio like you. When I work out, it's just resistance training. And I weigh maybe 185. And I don't, at that intake, I'm not gaining weight. And that's not to
Mm-hmm.
say you should be able to eat as much as I am. Like, clearly, we're different people, different experiences, and everybody's going to respond differently. 400 to 500 grams of carbs is not this kind of like, you shouldn't be anywhere near this. It might actually
Okay.
serve you to eat double what you're aiming for now intentionally, is what I'm getting at. But
Okay.
again, having your own, like, creating or establishing that awareness, creating it for yourself, I think would be invaluable to know for sure, because you might find that even just from doing that and rearranging when those calories are coming in throughout your day, that you start to see a little bit more consistency, less fluctuation on the scale, less fluctuation with like your digestion, with bloating, maybe that you're waking up in the morning feeling a little bit leaner, your hunger is a little bit more normalized, your energy in your training sessions a little bit higher, so that performance is a little bit better. And over time, you might find same energy input for the most part, but the overall output is just vastly different and feels different because of the distribution of the nutritional intake. So I think that that's the biggest thing,
Okay.
because it's hard to, without you knowing exactly where your intake is,
Right.
I don't know either if the first step would be, let's drop it or not. It's certainly like, if you were going to be a client of mine and we were starting this week, that's what I would want you to do. I would ask you to say, in some way, shape, or form, whether you're like actually accurately tracking everything, like, let's see where you're falling for real in reality
Right.
with all the calories, carbs, all of it. Because it can be eye opening. And it doesn't have to be eye opening in like a, I'm so bad, like, I can't believe I'm doing this type of
Right.
way, because again,
Right.
all these numbers are just kind of like arbitrary, or they're relative, they're subjective. Like, if you've tracked 400 grams of carbs, it's not this like, I'm doing something wrong, I'm failing. To me, I'd be like, again, I do that every day basically. So
Right.
it can be normal. It doesn't have to be good versus bad. And
Okay.
that's why I like tracking. I think I've always been a numbers guy. I'm not sure what you do for work, but I come from like a data driven,
Oh yeah, no, I know what you
field.
do for work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actuary.
Beforehand. Yeah, beforehand. So I'm like, numbers, they tell a story, they give you, they're predictable, you know what I mean? And in that way, they're emotionless to me. But you don't get that until you've looked at the numbers over and over and over again. Same thing with scale weights. But yeah, that's what I would say is kind of like the low hanging fruit. Again, if we want to talk about simple interventions, what do we do differently? I don't think it's, you got to add workouts, or you probably don't have to change your resistance training structure. If you're doing upper lower, I'm sure you're doing like bench press, rows, squats, some type of
Right.
hinge, right? And you're
Mm-hmm.
probably trying to add weight when and where you can, week over week. But
Right.
little things like that, even, does that happen predictably for you? Like, if you're, let's just
It
take upper
has.
body bench press, you getting stronger?
Yes. No, I'm getting stronger. I'm feeling stronger. And especially, I've only been lifting weights for 12 weeks now, so and being 40, I've been a little bit hesitant to really push, but now I'm starting to feel more confident, to
See,
sort of
that's
push
such a
the
cool.
weights.
You mentioned too, like like week 1 or whatever, you started lifting, scale went up, right? You're in one of these positions where it's very possible to build a substantial amount of muscle pretty darn quickly, because yeah, you've been fit in a way all your life, not in the specific way that hypertrophy muscle building training entails. And that stimulus is new, it's fresh to your body, your system as a whole. Like, those adaptations happen so quick as a beginner in that sense, that I'm not surprised at all that the scale went up. Like, you're building muscle, there's new tissue, new cells there that are going to need hydrated with water, hydrated with like glycogen and carbs that fill them up. All that has weight to it. And so it's like, yeah, the scale went up, but if your performance is going up as well, it kind of makes sense. It's a kind of a
Right.
good thing. And I know that can be kind of, it seems like the opposite of what we want. But then I like to remind people of, especially if you don't truly care about what the scale says necessarily, you just want to be moving in the right direction,
Right.
that the scale can go up, or you can add mass to your body while also lowering your body fat percentage, because there's essentially three ways that can happen, right? With reducing your body fat percentages, you just lose body fat and nothing else. You add muscle tissue and nothing else, or do both at the same time. In all three of those cases, your body fat percentage is actually dropping and you're getting leaner, but it's not all tied to just like scale going down. So I'm like, everything seems like it's in line from an
Okay. So I mean,
a
let me ask you. So I mean, like I started off at like 208, and I'm like now 218. Can I have really gained that
so
much
between in
in
12
12
weeks,
weeks? Yeah.
that much muscle?
Right. I
Probably
don't.
not. Yeah,
Probably not.
probably
That's
not.
what I'm thinking.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's close
Right.
to a pound per week.
Right.
I will say, like, if you're so if
And
you
the
were
other
to
thing,
be
I started taking creatine, which I've never taken in my life, and I do take a protein powder once a day.
okay, so
But yeah,
then is your protein a little bit closer to like 150 per day than the
probably yeah.
130
Because
that I was
I
at?
try to
Okay,
have
because
that.
you're
I try to have that one protein shake, which so
like
skim
a single
milk,
scoop.
a single scoop.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe you're coming closer to one. Then that was what I was gonna get at too. Like if you were being perfect with like 200 grams of protein every single day, if you had zero stress in your life, got 9 hours of sleep every single night, split your training up in different sessions like you're doing, would adding close to a pound of muscle per week be possible for a brand new beginner to resistance training? Might be if you're a high responder, but because your protein isn't the highest in the world, because I
Hmm.
think that it's likely not a
Right.
full
Right.
pound of muscle, but certainly some, you know what I mean. But regardless, it keeps coming back to, well, we'd have to be perfect with like your calorie intake too, of consuming like the right amount to be in maintenance without knowing where that falls. Like it could be very obvious that you're clearly in a surplus and that some of that scale weight is going to be fat as well.
Right.
So we just kind of keep coming back to establishing what that number is, figuring out like where are you actually at on average, because then that tells you where to go next. Do you reduce
Okay.
it, or do you just reallocate it? Because I don't think reducing immediately is just the first thing that I would do, given that you're so active, or else you're just going to figure out or find out yourself in that same situation where you're like, this is sad. I'm really hungry.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I can't do
Yeah.
this for very long. So that's the overall thing too, is no matter what, if I were to give you this like specific cadence and frequency of training, this specific like meal plan to follow, and like this would get you exactly where you want to be by March or summer, if you can't actually adhere to it and won't afterwards anyway, like what's the point? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where my head keeps going in terms of the nutritional component. Is I wouldn't change anything that you're doing from an exercise standpoint. It sounds like that's solid, that's going well, it fits into your life. It's really just kind of like reallocating what the nutrition looks like on a day-to-day basis. And maybe, this is sometimes the hard part, but it sounds like your husband's, supportive, even though there might be some kind of like joking, like you might get the eye roll of like, have fun with that salad. I'm eating.
Right.
I'm eating
Right.
this.
Right.
But, could be open to a conversation of, again, how do we restructure our grocery trips every week so that there can be a fourth meal in there or what have you, so that it's not just on you. But, when he's out there, he's also, I'll grab some cottage cheese or Greek yogurt because Oliver's going to make this bowl every day now, in addition to his breakfast or what have you.
Right.
So that can go a really long way too.
Great. So yeah, I will start I will track dinner, and I will track I'm going to do at least one day where I'll try to track everything that I eat to get a real
I'd be
honest
very
picture.
curious if you can let me know
Sure.
what the calories are, what the carbs are like. And then again, I think that will tell you, it may be very clear that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the choice is, or the right intervention is, I gotta lower something. I gotta find a way to change what we're eating, switch up these dinners, find some alternative recipes that are just as enjoyable, but a little bit less dense, a little bit lighter. That could certainly be part of it. Or it could just be, how do I just rearrange some of this so that like I'm not going into these dinners starving, so that I'm not snacking beforehand, I'm not snacking so much afterwards, shrink the gap between meals. And it could be that reallocation without changing the actual consumption from a quantity perspective at all.
Okay. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll track it and I'll email it to you.
Yeah, let me know. I'll take a look. And because again, I couldn't really tell you what to change without knowing that first.
Sure.
Other than, the just standard things, you clearly understand that, hey, a little bit more protein is probably going to be beneficial. So how do we get that in? Which could be as simple as having an extra ounce of turkey in that lunch, 6 hard-boiled egg whites as opposed to just 4. Those are the simplest ways to ensure, or 2 scoops of protein instead of just 1, because now even if you
Yeah.
just did that, you're up to 180 almost for the day, and I would say that's pretty darn good. So those little things repeated over time can go a really, really long way. And again, just alter your biofeedback so that a little bit less hungry, a little bit less, food focused, needing to snack less at night. And then it could happen naturally where
Okay.
maybe I'm eating 300 calories less per day mindlessly just because I'm not going into that evening phase of my day in this huge deficit from not eating enough throughout the day and 2 training sessions. You know what I mean? So simple, obvious, but sometimes those are the hardest for us to kind of like think about. We always want to go specific, right? Like dive right into the deep end, but basics first usually.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been hugely helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions about, anything else, but while we're still on?
I mean, well, here's one thing that, in the back of my mind, so I started lifting weights back in October, right? Because I'm like, I really want to like change my body, build mass, get ready for pool season this coming year, right?
Right. 6 months from now.
6 months, yeah. And and my husband and I, we joined our neighborhood pool several years ago. So in the summer, especially in the summer, June, July, and August, every evening we're at the pool, right? It's good weather, which normally it is here. If it's hot, if it's sunny, we're at the pool. And I'm already starting to think, like, how in the world am I going to row 5 days a week and lift 4 days a week and still,
have the time
to go to the pool every evening? Like, because that's also very important, right? At least in the summertime, like that's our time to do it,
One thing that I would say, because again, we've talked about the physical outcome that you want from like a changing your body composition is 99% nutrition driven, right? So if that is optimized and you make some changes and you're consistently consuming the appropriate amount of calories, the right distribution of proteins, fats, carbs, so on and so forth, and you also actually are at that point, let's say you reduce your rowing to 3 days per week and you reduce your lifting, resistance training to 3 days per week. Now you're at 6 total sessions as opposed to 9. And in some cases, like if you're rowing and doing upper body, like you said, maybe those days where it's a Friday night, you're going to the pool that night, you can do both of those at lunch, so you've gotten 2 out of those 6 sessions done. Now you've only got 4 outside of that. And in my opinion, you can get, obviously you're going to get total quantity. You're going to get less, mileage done rowing wise. There's going to be less there, but from like a resistance training standpoint, you can get the same overall training volume done in a 3 day per week split as you can in a 4, and not have it be any worse for you or like you get any less results. I think that there's a big misconception there when it comes to more is more from a training standpoint, which in some way, shape, or form, sure, if you're like only have 2 days per week, yeah, you can definitely get more done in 4 or 5. But if you're talking about going from 4 to 3, you obviously have to rearrange things a little bit. Maybe it's 3 full body lifts, or you're doing 1 upper, 1 lower, and 1 full body lift. You can still train each muscle group 2 times. You can still allocate the same amount of kind of overall training volume in a per set per muscle group way, evenly or relatively close, and the outcome be net 0, basically no difference, just because you're training 3 days per week. And that gives you more. That's what I did over the past year. I used to train 5 on average lifts, and now I'm at 3. And certainly I'm doing a little bit less training volume, but I'm also training full body now as opposed to push, pull, legs, or whatever I was doing, what I mean? So it's like weekly kind of equals out to be the same. So that's probably what I would do come April, as you're getting closer and closer to those warmer months, is actually start to rearrange how much the frequency and, condense some of it a little bit, because you can get the same total weekly work done in less time if it's structured a little bit differently. And again, outcome wise, from like muscle building, fat, body composition, if your nutrition is on point, that reduction in training output or volume isn't going to be the thing that's like, okay, well, now your dial's turning back. Like, you're not going to start
Okay.
regressing at that point, especially because maintenance of fitness is so much easier and requires so much less work, less time than creating new adaptations. So let's say, you go through this between October and April, that would be basically 6 months of you training weights 4 days per week, right?
Hmm.
So that's all building, gaining,
Right.
putting on mass. You can maintain that mass that you've built arguably with like one resistance training session per week. If you just did like a few hard sets of a bench press, a squat, or whatever, you hit each muscle group once per week with a few hard sets, you're not going to lose that muscle mass. It's so much easier to maintain it. So that could kind of be like your yearly periodization of like, maybe I'm going to build. And then because summer I'm just more social, like I have less time, I want to be more, outside of the gym more, just do less and you're not going to lose that muscle tissue.
Okay, good. That's a relief.
Yeah, it's actually shocking how I mean, there's not like an exact figure of like you only need to do one set, but really most people are going to the gym and doing, let's just say on average 10 sets per muscle group per week, whether that be 5 sets of bench on one day, 5 the other day, or whatever. You could probably do a third of that and not lose any muscle tissue at all. So it's reassuring to believe that, right? To see it through.
Right. Well, great. No, thank you. This has been,
Yeah,
this has been hugely helpful. So
you're very welcome. When it comes to our health and fitness, these discussions are necessary because there's nuance with everything. As you heard, like I don't have specific answers I can just give, like do this exact thing, change this exact variable, because it kind of depends on what you're actually doing right now. So that awareness creation is invaluable in many cases before you actually make it a change. One of the things I tell my clients often is your initial thought shouldn't be, what do I need to do differently, but what can I do better within the parameters that I'm already working in, before you adjust those parameters. So that's kind of where we're at now, and I hope you do keep me updated with in figuring out what that looks like, creating that awareness, and then from there use it to leverage your future decisions.
Okay, great.
So cool. Yeah, I appreciate you being on. As I always say for everybody else, when it comes to your health and fitness goals, there are no right answers. There's only nuance. I'm John Knoll, and thanks for listening.